Just had an interesting group of characters in the school I grew up with. Probably one of the more interesting was a kid by the name of Chucky Rawls. Went to school with Chucky in 7th grade. Chucky was as country as biscuits and gravy while you're watching a tractor pull. I mean, he was country. When Chucky would run around, he would always yell out, "Haw!" just like that. It sounded like Jerry Clower sounded like he was running from a bear, but that's the way Chucky always did everything. And he was one of those kids that just by his very nature, he made himself a target a few times. Before I get to Chucky's story, I got to tell you a little bit about Empire High School. When we were in 7th grade, some genius decided that we should just have one long lunch period rather than separate the junior high kids from the high school kids because we were at such a small school. And since it didn't take very long to go into our cafeteria and look at your tray and realize you didn't want to eat that, you had plenty of free time afterwards. So most of us would just hang out in front of the high school until the bell rang. And our high school, and I don't know if that picture doesn't do it justice, there used to be all these bushes that were planted out in front of it that blocked off the sidewalk. And the seniors used to love to find a 7th grader, and they would chase, they would pick one seemingly at random, and they would grab one would grab that 7th grader by the hands, the other would grab him by the feet, and they'd drag him over to those bushes in a nice swinging motion. They'd get him a couple of times and whoop, and let him up in the air, and they would come down right in the middle of that bush. And that was getting bushed. And if you were a 7th grader, you were getting bushed. I mean, that's just the way it worked, right? And you'd try to extricate yourself from that bush, but you'd be buried deep into it, and you'd have to crawl the way out, and the seniors would get quite a good laugh out of it. And it was something that happened to all of us at one point in time, but it seemed to happen a lot more to Chucky. And Chucky was just fast enough that if he caught wind of what the seniors were doing, he could outrun them, even in his cowboy boots and Wranglers. And the seniors did not like that. If they wanted to bush you, it was time for you to get thrown in the bush. So one day they see Chucky coming along and decide that he was not going quietly into that bush. And so he kicked and he turned and he fought back as best as he could, but come on, these guys are seniors, and Chucky was a 7th grader. So pretty soon they had his hands and his feet, and they got him started on that little swinging motion, but this time I guess they were a little bit overly excited, and as they threw Chucky up, he came down just past the bush. He caught enough of it that it spun him around, but when he hit the ground, there was a thud and a crack. Now, I don't know if you know this, but you're not supposed to be able to touch your right elbow with your right hand. But at that moment, Chucky Rawls could do just that. Well, the seniors, they knew they did something they should not to, so they walked over and gingerly picked up Chucky, and they escorted him into our high school principal's office / counselor's office / first aid station and said, "This poor 7th grader got hurt." Well, our principal, who was no fool, looked at Chucky and noticed that he had a few stems sticking out of his hair, and he was laying there cradling a broken arm, and he looked at Chucky and he said, "What happened to you?" Chucky looked up and saw those senior guys standing there. He looked at the principal and he said, "I must have failed." Well, principal tried a few more times to get Chucky to tell him exactly what happened and how he came to break that arm, but something changed that day. Because from then on, when Chucky would walk down the hallway and we'd pass a group of seniors, we'd normally dip our heads down and kind of dip ourselves out of the way to make sure they didn't think we were cocky enough that maybe today we should get thrown in the bushes. But when Chucky would walk by, he'd just say, "How you guys doing?" And they'd say, "Hey, Chucky, how are you?" Pat him on the back. Boy, anything I couldn't figure out, because somehow those seniors now thought Chucky Rawls was the most exciting 7th grader they'd ever laid eyes on. Chucky learned a valuable lesson that day. Your enemies can become your best buddies if you just treat them right. Abraham Lincoln was once asked by one of his cabinet members. They said, you treat your enemies with such kindness. You would think that you would want to destroy them. Lincoln responded, he said, you destroy your enemies when I make them my friend. We live in a world today that has an adversarial of versus them. Your side, my side. And we have so many opposing forces. And it's not just enough anymore to say, I don't agree with this person. It's not just enough to say, I don't support this position. You have to hate the other side. You can't just support your side. You have to hate the other side. You have to condemn them. You have to attack them. But folks, we need to think that might not be the most Christian response. Romans 12:18 tells us, if possible, as far as it depends upon you, be at peace with all men. Here the text tells us to look to seek for peace. Not to try to make an enemy, but to try to be at peace with all men. Of course, the passage tells us if it's impossible, because we know, just like Abraham Lincoln knew, that you couldn't make everybody happy. There were some things that you would have to oppose, and in doing some, you might make an enemy, that we would do everything we can to treat them better than they deserve. Everybody say, I hate you and you hate me. You know what? You may hate me, but I don't have to hate you. A man may stand against us on a different side of an issue. A man may stand against us in a position that we do not believe is right, but we can still treat that person differently. Jesus challenges us in Matthew chapter 5 and verses 43 through 48 to do just that. Jesus said, you've heard it said. In other words, this is what most people think, to love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Well, I can love the guy who I'm close to. I can love the person who agrees with me, who we share commonality to. But the guy who's opposed to me, I can hate him. I can do whatever I want to him because he is my enemy. But Jesus says, no. I tell you, you pray for them. I tell you, you love them. I tell you, you do good to them. Now, why does he tell us that? He tells us that in verse 44 when he says, because God is that way. Your Father in heaven does good to those who oppose him. He sends the same care and concern to the righteous as he does the unrighteous. In verse 46, he challenges us even further. It says, if you do love only those who love you, how are you any different than the world? You're not to be like the world. You're to be like God, to be perfect, as he says in verse 48, as your heavenly Father is perfect. You see, the challenge that Jesus is making is to not just look at our enemies as someone that we want to destroy, but as someone we want to make our friend. Just someone we stand opposed to, but someone we want to reconcile to. To treat our enemies much differently than they would treat us. That characteristic would make us look like God. Is it any wonder why Jesus would tell his disciples in John 13:35 that all men will know that you are my disciples if you have a person is truly a follower of Christ, is truly like God. You do so when you show love to an enemy. When you forgive someone who stands opposed to you. When you treat someone with kindness who isn't your friend. When you treat your enemy like he's your best buddy. John would say in 1 John chapter 3, verses 10 and 11, but this, the children of God and the children of the devil, are obvious. Anyone who does not practice righteousness is of not God, and nor is the one who does not love his brother. For this is the message you have heard from the beginning, that we ought to love one another. John says, how do you see? It's obvious. You look at somebody and you can tell if they're a child of God. You can tell by their behavior they're righteous, but you can also tell that they love their brother, that they love other people, that their defining characteristic is love. And how is that more powerfully shown than when we love our enemies? Gandhi was once quoted as saying, "It is easy enough to be friendly to one's friends, but to befriend the one who regards himself as your enemy is the quintessential essence of true religion. The other is mere business." Mere business. What the world does. Fairly or kind to them. But Christians, we're called to something higher, something greater. The true essence of God and religion when we love those who regard us as an enemy. Jesus would tell his followers in Matthew chapter 5 and verses 26 through 25 to make friends quickly with your opponent at the law while you're on the way, so that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge to the officer, and you will be thrown in prison. Truly, I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid up the last cent. Here Jesus is saying, before you go to court, before you escalate that problem, be friends with your opponent. Now we think of as our opponent as someone they're our enemy. They stand against us. But here Jesus says, take that opponent and make them your friend. Why? Because in doing so, you're going to save yourself a lot of trouble. In doing that, you're going to save yourself a lot of misery. It's funny in history what people have gone to war over. There was a war that happened in South America that basically started because of a badly officiated soccer game. There was a war called the War of Jenkins' Left Ear. It was a war that basically started because of a man named Jenkins' left ear that got cut off. There was a war called the War of the Oaken Bucket, which was basically started because they were fighting over, an oaken bucket. Now, I can tell you that in all those situations, there were lots of other issues that came to front, but in the end, it was something silly, something that people decided to escalate to the point where they were ready to kill one another over. That desire that we say of, I'm going to take an enemy and I'm going to fight them to the death, it usually does more than just harm the enemy, it harms us as well. Consider the words that Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verses 8 through 12. He tells us there to sum up, be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly, kind-hearted, and humble in spirit. Not returning evil for evil or insult for insult, but a blessing instead. For you were called for that very purpose, that you might inherit a blessing. Sounds a lot like the words of Jesus. Live at peace. Don't return evil for evil, but give a blessing. Why? So that we could receive the reward of being of God. Continue to verse 10. For the one who desires life, to love and see good days, must keep his tongue from evil and his lips from seeking deceit. We can see that, right? If we want to have a right light, we need to make sure that we're not speaking evil things and speaking deceit towards other people. But notice verse 11. He must turn away from evil and do good. He must seek peace and pursue it. He must turn away from evil and do good. The problem with an adversarial position towards others, they're my enemy, so I can treat them poorly. They're my enemy, I can attack them. They're my enemy, I can speak against them. They're my enemy, I can be violent towards them. I can be hate-filled towards them. I can burn and kill and destroy. But the problem is when we do that, we are not doing good, but we're doing evil, seeking war. There's an old saying that says, he who takes vengeance must dig two graves, one for his enemy and one for himself. You see, when we don't love our neighbor, we're hating our neighbor. And if we're hating our neighbor, we're doing evil. And we're harming ourselves in the same time we are trying to harm our enemy. In trying to destroy them, we are destroying ourselves. Hate is a dangerous emotion. It's a dangerous emotion to carry, and it warps everything that it touches. And the more that we carry that hate, the more that we keep our hate, we may think that we're channeling it towards an enemy, but what we're really doing is bringing it back upon ourselves. If we want to love life, if we want to see good days, we must turn away from evil, because the eyes of the Lord are towards the righteous. His ears are attentive to their prayers. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. And let me add, the face of the Lord is against those who do evil, who think they're doing it for the right reasons. It doesn't matter. You're still doing evil. But I know what you're thinking. If I forgive my enemy, it's not fair. You're thinking like Chucky. They tossed me into a bush. They broke my arm. How is it fair that these guys are going to get away with this? But you know, the truth of the matter is, they don't. We may not be the one that seeks revenge, but that doesn't mean that there isn't an avenger. We may not be the one who attacks back, but that doesn't mean that they are free from repercussions. Romans chapter 12, verses 19 through 21 tells us, never take your own revenge, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it is victory. Feed him. If he is thirsty, give him drink. In doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. You see, if we put ourselves in the revenge business, we're going to be putting ourselves in the evil business. Because our perceptions of those things are off, but God's isn't. God is the one who will repay. Vengeance is his. We are taking away something from God. But if we show kindness and goodness to our enemy, what we do is we up the ante on them. Because how could they stand before God and say, well, they deserved it? Kind and compassionate to you, yet you still acted that way. Do you think God will then let those people go free? 2 Thessalonians 1:6 says, after all, it is only just for God to repay with affliction those who afflict you. God is not unjust. But we need to leave room for God's wrath. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. That's exactly what we're talking about. When we try to seek our own revenge, when we hate our enemy, we allow that evil to come in our lives, an evil that can overcome us. But we can overcome evil with good. Oscar Wilde was once quoted as saying, always forgive your enemies. Nothing annoys them as much. It's hard to be enemies with somebody who just won't hate you back. It's hard to be enemies with someone who just treats you better than they deserve. You have to be pretty hard-hearted and pretty cold. And even a person who's hard-hearted and cold with someone who shows love for them time and time again, no matter what they do to them, there's something about that. Well, there's something about that just changes a person. Like Lincoln said, you defeat your enemies by making them your friends. See, the ultimate example of love is to forgive and to treat well those who mistreat you. You see, when Jesus calls us to do that, he is not calling us to do something that he doesn't understand. But you don't understand, God. You don't know how bad they've been to me. You don't know what they did to me. But he knows. Luke chapter 23 and verses 33 through 34, it talks about those criminals who were standing on his right and left. It talks about those who were casting, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. The very people who nailed him to the cross, the very people who were standing in judgment before him, the very people who you could say were his enemies, Father, forgive them. But that's not the only enemies that Jesus tried to befriend on the cross. Romans 5, verse 6, it tells us that while we were still helpless, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. For one will hardly die for a righteous man, though for perhaps a good man someone would dare to die. But God demonstrated his own love towards us, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Much more than being justified by his blood, we'll be saved by the wrath of God through him. For it is while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son. Having been much more than reconciled, we'll be saved by his life. You see, Christ did something even greater than he's asking us to do. When we love our enemies, we do so saying, well, God will repay. But when Christ showed the greatest love for those who were his enemies, he did so God would not repay. That they could be saved from the wrath of God through him. He was giving them an opportunity to escape what was due. We were his enemies while we were sinners. You want to know how to defeat your enemies? You treat them like your friends. You want to know how you make those who seemingly abuse you and you treat them better than they deserve? You do what's right and good because it's right and good, not because of what everyone else does to you. In a world today that wants everyone to pick sides, that wants everyone to go to war over just about every issue they can think of, Christians, we need to be peacemakers. By pretending there's no difference, but rather by treating those who stand against us not as enemies, but as someone worthy of love. We can do it because that's what was done, forgiven. We can love because he first loved us. It's one of the hardest teachings of Jesus, but maybe one of the ones that can do the most good in our world today. We think about all the problems that we face. We think about all the difficulties that are in our world. Christians, that means we need to love all the more. We need to love completely, not just because we like them, they're our neighbors, they're like us, but even when they're our enemies. We need to hold ourselves to a higher standard, God's standard. Because if we hold ourselves to that standard, if we become more like him, then we become his children. We shine like lights. We change the world. Christ did everything while you stood as his enemy to make you his friend. You may be here today and you're not in a right relationship with God. You still stand as an enemy because you still stand in sin. It wouldn't be some Christ has died for you. He's given you the means to have that sin washed away. He shed his blood so that your forgiveness can be found. But you have to listen to his voice. You have to accept his offer. Maybe as a Christian, you haven't been living in a way that shows his light. Maybe you have been too caught up in hate, and that hate has warped you. And it's made you think and behave in ways that aren't the way that hold the God standard. And maybe you need some support and encouragement to help you overcome that. Tonight we offer an invitation for those who would come to put on Christ Jesus, for those who need to come home and make their life right. Maybe you need someone to pray for you tonight about something that you're struggling with. This is the opportunity to do just that. If you need to answer God's call tonight, we invite you to do so while we sing this song.